The first sign wasn't something they saw. It was something they stopped hearing. The wind had been steady all morning, the kind of low, constant pressure that Arctic travelers use to orient themselves, even without looking at a compass. Then, without warning or transition, it simply ceased. Not gradually. Not as though they had moved into the shelter of a ridge or ice formation. It just ended, and the air became perfectly still. The lead guide, a man named Jakob Peterson, noticed it first because his dogs noticed it first. The animals had been pulling steadily, their breath visible in sharp rhythmic clouds. Then, within the span of a few seconds, every dog in the line slowed. Their heads dropped, their ears flattened against their skulls. They did not stop entirely, but they pulled as though moving through water, reluctant and tense. Peterson called a halt. The other two sleds came alongside. No one spoke immediately. There was an unspoken understanding among men who spent their lives in that environment that certain changes required attention before conversation. The snow beneath them was firm. The sky was overcast but stable. There were no visible storms, no pressure cracks in the ice, no scent of open water. Everything appeared normal, except for the silence. One of the other guides, a younger man named Anderson, finally said it aloud. He asked if anyone else had noticed that the wind had stopped. Peterson nodded. The third guide, an older Inuit man whose name was recorded only as Agar, said nothing. He was looking at the dogs. They were still pulling, but their bodies were low, their tails tucked. It was not cold weather posture. It was the way animals behaved when they sensed something nearby that they could not see. Peterson dismounted and walked ahead of the lead dog. He scanned the horizon in every direction. The terrain was flat and featureless, broken only by low drifts and occasional patches of rough ice. There was no movement, no shadows, no indication of another living thing within miles. Yet the silence persisted, and it felt located, as though they had stepped into a pocket of dead air that had no meteorological reason to exist. They continued forward. Within 10 minutes the wind returned. It aimed back all at once, pressing against their faces and stirring the surface snow into fine streams that slid across the ice like water. The dogs lifted their heads. Their pace quickened. Peterson felt the tension leave his shoulders. He told himself it had been a minor anomaly, a trick of terrain or temperature that had created a temporary stillness. But 20 minutes later it happened again. The wind stopped. The air went dead. The dogs slowed and lowered their heads. This time Peterson did not call a halt. He urged the dogs forward, watching them closely. They obeyed, but their reluctance was obvious. Their bodies remained tense. Their ears stayed flat. The silence moved with them. It did not stay in one location. It was not a feature of the landscape. It followed, or preceded, or surrounded them at intervals that felt irregular but not random. Peterson began to mark the occurrences mentally. The silence would last anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. Then the wind would return. Then, after a stretch of normal travel, the silence would come back. By midday, all 3 guides had stopped trying to explain it as weather. Agar spoke only once during that period. He said, in his language, that the air had been removed. Peterson understood enough to know that he was not speaking metaphorically. He meant it literally. Something had taken the wind away from that specific area, and it was doing so repeatedly. They made camp earlier than planned. The silence had returned twice more during the afternoon, and the dogs were becoming harder to control. One of the younger animals had begun whining, a high, thin sound that did not stop until Peterson physically held its head and spoke to it. Even then it continued to tremble. That night, the wind blew steadily. The snow moved in visible patterns across the ice. Everything sounded as it should, but none of the men slept well. Peterson lay awake in his tent, listening. He realized with a creeping discomfort he did not want to name that he was not listening for something to begin. He was listening for something to stop. These were not men prone to nervousness. Jakob Peterson had been guiding routes across the Arctic ice for 11 years. He had survived whiteouts, equipment failures, and an incident in 1907 where his sled had gone through a concealed fracture, and he had spent 4 hours in water cold enough to kill most men in minutes. He had learned to read ice the way other men read printed text. The sound it made under a sled's runners told him whether it was safe. The tone of the wind informed him when a storm was building hours before it arrived. The behavior of his dogs gave him information no instrument could provide. Anderson, the younger guide, had less experience but had been trained by men like Peterson. He understood the protocols. He knew how to space sleds to distribute weight on questionable ice. He knew the difference between the crackling sound of surface frost and the deep groaning that meant structural instability below. He had been taught that panic was a faster killer than cold, and he had learned to keep his mind clear even when circumstances turned bad. Agar, the eldest of the three, had knowledge that went deeper than training. He had been born into a culture that treated the ice as a living system, one that required respect and attention. He knew which animals moved where and when. He knew how to interpret changes in light, in snow texture, in the way cold air settled into low areas at dusk. He did not rely on maps. He navigated by memory, by pattern, by an understanding of the environment that was more comprehensive than anything written down. All three men understood that silence in the Arctic was not the same as silence elsewhere. In most environments, quiet means safety. In the Arctic, silence is a warning. It means the wind has stopped moving across a frozen lake, which may indicate that the ice is thin and flexing. It means animals have left an area, which can signal the presence of a predator or an imminent collapse of a snow shelf. It means the usual acoustic markers, the ones a traveler uses to orient themselves in low visibility, are gone. The guides had developed an informal system for categorizing risk. High wind was inconvenient but manageable. Heavy snow reduced visibility but could be waited out. Cracking ice required caution but could be navigated if approached correctly. Silence, though, was treated as a reason to stop and assess. It meant something had changed in a way that was not immediately visible. That was why the silence they encountered the previous day was not something they could dismiss. It had no explanation. It was not tied to terrain features. It did not correlate with temperature shifts or changes in wind direction. It simply appeared, persisted for minutes at a time, and then vanished, and it repeated. By the second day, the silence had occurred 6 times. Each time, the dogs reacted before the men did. Each time, the air became unnaturally still. And each time, when the wind returned, it did so abruptly, as though a barrier had been removed. Peterson made the decision to continue the route. They were carrying supplies for a group of researchers who were waiting at a coastal station nearly 40 miles to the northwest. The delay caused by turning back would create complications, and the researchers were depending on the delivery to extend their work into the following month. More practically, turning back would mean covering the same ground where the silence had been occurring. It was not clear that retreat would be safer than continuation, but Peterson also made a secondary decision. He told Anderson and Agar that if the silence continued, if it increased in frequency or duration, they would abort the route regardless of the consequences. Agar nodded. Anderson asked what Peterson thought was causing it. Peterson did not answer, because he did not have an answer that made sense. But privately, he had begun to suspect that the silence was not environmental. It was produced. And if it was produced, that meant something was producing it. They found the tracks on the morning of the 3rd day. Agar saw them first. He stopped his sled without calling out, and the other 2 guides pulled alongside. All 3 men dismounted and walked forward slowly, their boots crunching on the frozen surface. The tracks were enormous. They were not the neat round impressions of a seal, nor the elongated prints of a fox or Arctic hare. They were large, heavy, and clearly made by something that walked on 4 limbs. The shape was similar to a polar bear's paw, but the proportions were wrong. Each print was nearly twice the width of a normal bear track. The depth was significant, indicating an animal of tremendous weight, but the spacing between prints suggested a stride length that was too long for the size. Peterson crouched next to one of the tracks and placed his gloved hand inside it for scale. His hand, even spread wide, did not come close to covering the width. He looked up at Agar, who was standing a few feet away, staring not at the tracks themselves, but at the area around them. The snow in a wide radius surrounding the tracks had been compressed. It was not simply disturbed. It had been pressed down evenly, as though something very large had stood in that spot for an extended period. The compression was smooth and uniform, which ruled out wind or drifting. Peterson stood and walked the perimeter of the compressed area. It was roughly circular, maybe 12 feet across. In the center were the tracks, leading in from the east and continuing west for approximately 30 feet. Then they stopped, not at an obstruction, not at a ridge or a change in terrain. They simply ended, as though the creature had lifted itself into the air or ceased to exist. Peterson walked past the final print, scanning the snow ahead for any continuation. There was nothing. The surface beyond was smooth and undisturbed. Anderson called out from behind him. He was standing near the area where the tracks had first appeared. He pointed downward. Peterson returned and saw what Anderson had noticed. The tracks did not gradually appear, as they would if an animal had approached from a distance and only begun leaving prints once it reached softer snow. They began suddenly, fully formed, as though the creature had been placed onto the ice at that exact spot. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Peterson walked the length of the trackway again, counting the prints. There were 9 on the left side, 9 on the right. 18 total impressions, each one clear and deep. Then nothing. Agar finally said something in his own language. Peterson did not catch all of it, but he understood enough. Agar was saying that the tracks were not right, not unusual, not strange, not right. He was saying that whatever made them did not move the way a living animal moves. Peterson called the dogs forward to continue, but the animals refused. The lead dog planted its legs and pulled backward against the harness. The others followed its lead, their bodies tense and their ears flat. Peterson had never seen his lead dog refuse a command. He tried again, more firmly. The dog whined and pulled harder. He changed the route. Instead of continuing west, which would have taken them directly along the line where the tracks had stopped, he angled the sleds northwest. The dogs obeyed immediately. As soon as the new direction was set, they moved without resistance. Peterson glanced back at the tracks as they left the area. From a distance, they looked even less natural. The line they formed was too straight, the spacing too regular. It looked deliberate. That night, they made camp in a shallow depression between 2 low ice ridges. The wind was strong and cold, and for once Peterson was grateful for it. The sound of it moving over the ice was familiar and reassuring. But twice during the evening, as he checked the dogs and secured the sleds, he thought he heard it stop. Both times it resumed within seconds, and he told himself he was imagining it. The dogs would not settle. Normally, after a full day of travel, they would curl into tight balls and sleep immediately. Tonight, they remained awake, their heads up, their eyes fixed on the darkness to the west. Peterson sat near the sleds and watched them. He realized, with a clarity that made his chest tighten, that the dogs were not reacting to cold or exhaustion, or even fear in the usual sense. They were reacting to presence. They knew something was out there, and they knew it was aware of them. It was Agar who finally said the name. He waited until the other 2 men were inside the larger tent, sitting close to the small oil lamp that provided the only light. The wind outside was loud enough that conversation required raised voices, which meant privacy was guaranteed. Agar spoke in a mixture of his language and the Danish that Peterson and Anderson understood. He used the word nannerlock. Peterson knew the term. He had heard it years before, from another Inuit guide he had worked with briefly. At the time it had been mentioned in passing, part of a longer conversation about animal behavior and superstition. Peterson had not paid much attention. Now, hearing it again, he realized he should have. Agar explained it carefully. The nannerlock was not a story told to children. It was not a metaphor. It was a category, a name given to something that was observed rarely but consistently enough that it had to be accounted for. It resembled a polar bear in the same way that a bear resembles a dog. The shape was similar, but the size and behavior were not. The descriptions Agar provided were specific. The nannerlock was larger than any bear that had been measured or killed. Its shoulders were too high. Its limbs were too long. Its head was heavy and broad, but the proportions were subtly wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate. It moved with a silence that was unnatural for something of its size. When it walked across ice, it did not produce the sounds that other large animals made. When it stood still, it could remain motionless for hours. But the most important detail, the one that Agar emphasized multiple times, was its behavior. The nannerlock did not hunt the way bears hunted. It did not chase. It did not ambush. It followed. It appeared at a distance and remained there, watching. It moved when the traveler moved, but it did not close the gap quickly. It waited, and the longer it followed, the more frequently the silence appeared. Agar said that the silence was not a coincidence. It was part of how the creature operated. He did not know why or how, but he had been told by others who had encountered it that the silence always accompanied the nannerlock. It was a signal. It meant the creature was near, even when it could not be seen. Anderson asked if anyone had ever been harmed by it. Agar paused before answering. He said that people had disappeared in areas where the nannerlock had been seen. Not many, not often, but enough that the pattern was recognized. The disappearances were clean. No struggle, no blood, no torn equipment or scattered supplies, just absence. Peterson asked what was supposed to be done if the nannerlock began following a group. Agar's answer was direct. You did not camp where the silence kept returning. You did not continue in the direction the creature seemed to be steering you. You changed course, even if it meant taking a longer or more dangerous route. And if the nannerlock appeared clearly, close enough that its size and shape could not be mistaken, you abandoned the original plan entirely. The three men sat in silence after that. The lamp flickered. The wind pressed against the tent fabric. Peterson tried to think through the logic of what Agar had described, to find a rational explanation that fit the facts. He could not. The tracks they had seen that morning were real. The silence was real. The behavior of the dogs was real. And if those things were real, then the possibility that something was following them had to be considered seriously. Anderson asked if Agar thought the nannerlock was out there now. Agar looked toward the tent wall, in the direction where the dogs were staked. He said he thought it had been following them since the first day. He said he thought the silence had been a warning. And he said that if they saw it, if it allowed itself to be seen clearly, that would mean it had decided they were not leaving. They saw it the following evening, just before the light began to fail. The sky was overcast, the kind of flat gray that made distances hard to judge and shadows nearly invisible. Peterson had been scanning the horizon routinely throughout the day, a habit formed over years of travel in open terrain. He had seen nothing unusual. Then, as he glanced toward a low ridge of ice approximately 200 yards to the south, he stopped. There was something standing on the ridge. It was motionless. It was large enough that even at that distance, its shape was clearly defined against the sky. Peterson did not say anything immediately. He kept his eyes on it, waiting to see if it would move or resolve into something explainable. It did not. He called to Anderson and Agar, keeping his voice level. Both men stopped their sleds and turned to look where he was pointing. For several seconds, no one spoke. The shape remained still. It was positioned at the highest point of the ridge, fully exposed, as though it wanted to be seen. The first thing Peterson noticed was the size. It was far larger than any polar bear he had encountered. The shoulders were massive, broad and rounded in a way that suggested immense muscle structure. The head was proportionate to the body, but that meant it was enormous, heavier and wider than seemed functional. The limbs were visible even at that distance, thick and long, giving the creature a posture that was both familiar and incorrect. It was pale. Its fur caught what little light remained in the sky and appeared almost white, though there were areas, particularly around the head and shoulders, where the color seemed darker, as though stained or shadowed. The creature did not shift its weight. It did not turn its head. It simply stood, facing in their direction. Anderson whispered something Peterson did not catch. Agar said nothing. He had gone completely still, his hands resting on the sled rail, his eyes fixed on the ridge. Peterson forced himself to breathe evenly. He was trying to estimate the size, to compare it mentally to animals he had seen before. He decided it was at least half again as large as the biggest polar bear he had ever measured, possibly larger. The distance made precision difficult, but even accounting for perspective, the scale was wrong. He looked away briefly to check the dogs. They had all turned toward the ridge. Their bodies were low. Several were shaking. None of them made a sound. When Peterson looked back at the ridge, the creature had moved. It was no longer at the highest point. It was several feet to the left, closer to the base of the ridge. He had not seen it move. He had not heard anything. It had simply changed position during the 2 or 3 seconds he had looked away. His throat tightened. He told himself it was a trick of the light, that he had misjudged the original position, that his eyes were tired. But he knew that was not true. The creature had moved, and it had done so silently and without the transitional motion that a normal animal would produce. Peterson reached for the rifle secured to his sled. He did not raise it, but he wanted it within reach. Anderson saw the motion and did the same. Agar remained still. He was watching the creature with an expression that Peterson could not interpret. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to recognition or resignation. The creature remained in its new position for nearly a full minute. Then it moved again. This time, Peterson was watching directly, and he still did not see the motion clearly. The creature seemed to shift forward and down, as though descending the ridge, but the movement was too smooth, too continuous. It did not step. It flowed, and then it was in a new position, closer to the base of the slope. Peterson felt his pulse hammering in his throat. He wanted to move, to turn the sleds and put distance between them and the ridge, but he could not decide which direction to go. The creature was to the south. Moving east or west might bring them parallel to it. Moving north meant heading back the way they had come, losing a full day of progress. Agar spoke then, quietly but clearly. He said they needed to move now, and they needed to move north. Peterson started to object, but Agar cut him off. He said that the nannerlock was showing itself because it wanted them to know it was there. He said that if they continued south or west it would follow, and eventually it would stop letting them choose their direction. Anderson asked if going north would make it leave. Agar shook his head. He said it would follow regardless. But going north gave them a chance to reach rougher terrain, areas where the ice was broken and unstable, places the nannerlock might not be able to move through as easily. Peterson made the decision. He turned his sled and called to the dogs. They responded immediately, pulling hard, their bodies straining with urgency. The other 2 sleds followed. As they moved, Peterson looked back toward the ridge one final time. The creature was still there, but it had moved again. It was now standing at the base of the ridge, fully visible on flat ice, closer than it had been before, and it was not alone. Peterson could see, even in the failing light, that the area around the creature was perfectly still. The wind was blowing across the ice in every direction, stirring the surface snow into fine white streams. But in a circle around the Nanurluk, the air was motionless. The snow did not move. The silence had returned, and this time Peterson could see its edges. They traveled through the night. It was a violation of every safety protocol Peterson had ever followed, but the alternative was worse. Stopping meant remaining in one place long enough for the nannerlock to close the distance, and none of the men believed that was survivable. The dogs seemed to understand. They pulled without hesitation, their breath coming in hard, visible clouds, their bodies leaning into the harnesses. The silence returned within an hour. It came suddenly, cutting off the wind mid-gust, and the temperature seemed to drop with it. The dogs slowed but did not stop. Peterson urged them forward, his voice tight. The silence lasted 3 minutes. Then the wind returned, and with it came a sound from behind them, a deep groaning crack that echoed across the ice. Peterson turned and saw a dark line spreading across the surface approximately 50 yards back. It was not a natural fracture. It was too wide, too straight, and it was moving. The ice was splitting in a line that ran perpendicular to their route, as though something enormously heavy had stepped onto it and created a pressure wave that propagated outward. He shouted to the others and pointed. Anderson saw it and increased his pace. Agar, whose sled was at the rear, glanced back and then forward again. His face was unreadable, but his hands tightened on the sled rail. The fracture continued to spread, the sound of it like slow thunder, until it reached the edges of their visibility and stopped. The silence came again 20 minutes later. This time it lasted longer. Peterson counted the seconds in his head, trying to keep his breathing steady. The dogs began to pull erratically, some veering left, others right. He corrected them, but their panic was building. When the wind returned, it brought another cracking sound, closer this time, and Peterson realized with cold certainty that they were being steered. Every time the silence appeared, the ice behind them became unstable. The fractures were not random. They were forming in a pattern that cut off retreat and forced the group to continue in a specific direction. Peterson looked ahead and saw that the terrain was changing. The flat expanses they had been crossing were giving way to rougher ice, areas where pressure ridges had formed and the surface was broken into uneven slabs. He did not want to go that way. Rough ice meant slower travel, greater risk of sled damage, and the possibility of hidden gaps that could swallow a man or a dog before anyone realized what had happened. But the alternative was to turn back toward the fractures, and that was not an option. Ager called out from the rear. He said the nannerlock was visible again. Peterson turned and saw it, much closer now, perhaps 100 yards back. It was moving, not quickly but steadily, its massive body covering ground with strides that seemed too long for the speed at which it appeared to be traveling. The silence surrounded it, a visible distortion in the way the snow moved, a pocket of dead air that traveled with the creature. Peterson made a decision. He told Anderson to cut loose the supply sled he was towing. It was a secondary sled, loaded with non-essential equipment and additional food. Losing it would reduce their margin for survival, but the weight was slowing them down. Anderson obeyed without argument. He released the tow line, and the sled came to a stop behind them. The dogs pulling the remaining sleds increased their speed immediately. The nannerlock reached the abandoned sled within minutes. Peterson watched as the creature approached it, expecting the animal to stop and investigate, perhaps to destroy it or scatter the contents. Instead, the nannerlock stepped over the sled without pausing. It did not acknowledge the obstruction. It simply continued forward, its attention fixed on the group ahead. Peterson felt something close to despair. The creature was not interested in their supplies. It was not behaving like a scavenger or even a predator in the traditional sense. It was following them specifically, and nothing they did seemed to alter its course. The silence returned a third time, longer now, nearly 5 minutes. When the wind came back, the ice behind them collapsed entirely. Peterson heard it before he saw it, a deep, resonant roar that seemed to come from beneath the surface. He turned and watched as a section of ice the size of a building dropped away, tilting and sliding into black water that should not have been that close to the surface. The nannerlock was still there, standing on solid ice just beyond the collapse. It had not fallen. It had not been caught in the fracture. It stood at the edge, watching them, and Peterson understood then that the creature had known exactly where the ice would fail. It had driven them away from the collapse, not toward it. It was controlling their route with precision, forcing them into terrain that served a purpose Peterson could not yet understand. Agar shouted something, and Peterson turned forward again. Ahead, the rough ice was thicker, the ridges higher. The route was narrowing, and in the distance, barely visible in the dim light, Peterson saw another shape on the horizon. For a moment he thought it was a second nannerlock. Then he realized it was a pressure ridge, a massive wall of broken ice that blocked their path entirely. They were being funneled. The decision to abandon the route was not made consciously. It happened in stages, forced by circumstances that left no other option. The first stage came when Anderson's lead dog collapsed. The animal had been pulling harder than the others, taking the brunt of the load, and its body simply gave out. It fell mid-stride, dragging the rest of the team to a halt. Anderson stopped the sled and dismounted, kneeling beside the dog. It was still breathing, but its legs were shaking and its eyes were unfocused. He looked up at Peterson and shook his head. They could not wait. Anderson cut the dog from the harness and redistributed the remaining animals. The dog lay on the ice, panting, as the sleds moved forward. Peterson did not look back. He knew what would happen. He knew the dog would either freeze or the nannerlock would reach it. Either way, the animal was gone. The second stage came when they reached the base of the pressure ridge. Up close, it was worse than Peterson had feared. The ridge was nearly 20 feet high, a chaotic wall of ice slabs that had been pushed upward by tectonic forces beneath the surface. There was no clear path through it. Climbing over it would require unloading the sleds, carrying the equipment piece by piece, and then hauling the sleds themselves up and over. It would take hours, and they did not have hours. Agar proposed an alternative. He pointed to the east, where the ridge appeared to curve and possibly lower. He said there might be a gap, a place where the ice had fractured rather than piled up. It would mean deviating further from their original route, but it was the only option that allowed them to keep moving. Peterson agreed. They turned east and followed the base of the ridge. The silence came again, and this time it did not leave. The wind stopped, and the air became so still that Peterson could hear his own heartbeat. The dogs were moving slowly now, their bodies low and their breathing labored. One of them, a younger animal in Agar's team, began to whine, a high-pitched sound that did not stop. Then Peterson saw the nannerlock again, and this time it was close enough that he could see details he wished he could not. The creature was standing directly ahead, no more than 50 yards away, positioned at the exact point where the ridge curved. It was even larger than he had thought. Its shoulders were higher than a man's head. Its limbs were impossibly thick, corded with muscle that moved beneath the pale fur. The head was turned toward them, and Peterson could see the shape of its face, broad and heavy, with features that were bear-like but distorted, as though something had taken the template of a bear and stretched it in ways that violated proportion. The creature did not move. It stood in the only direction they could go, blocking the path as clearly as the ridge blocked the others. Peterson felt his hands begin to shake. He had been frightened before, during storms and equipment failures and moments when death had been a real possibility, but this was different. This was not fear of circumstance. This was fear of intent. The nannerlock was not simply present. It was choosing to be there. It was communicating. Agar spoke quietly. He said they needed to go back, to retreat into the rough ice they had passed earlier, even if it meant risking the sleds and the dogs. Peterson started to argue, but Anderson cut him off. He said Agar was right. He said that continuing forward meant confronting the nannerlock directly, and none of them believed that was survivable. They turned the sleds. The dogs obeyed, but their movements were slow and uncoordinated. The silence remained. As they began to move back toward the rough ice, Peterson glanced over his shoulder. The nannerlock had not moved. It stood in the same position, watching. Then, as Peterson looked away and back again, it was gone, not hidden, not obscured by terrain, simply absent, as though it had never been there. The third and final stage came when they entered the rough ice. The terrain was worse than Peterson had anticipated. The surface was broken into tilted slabs separated by narrow gaps, some shallow, some deep enough that the bottom was invisible. The sleds had to be maneuvered carefully, lifted over obstacles, dragged through spaces barely wide enough to accommodate them. One of the sleds broke. The left runner caught on a submerged edge of ice and splintered. The sled tipped, spilling half its load into a gap. Anderson and Agar stopped to help, and the three men worked in silence, salvaging what they could. The silence around them was total. No wind, no sound of shifting ice. No noise from the dogs. It was as though the entire environment had been suspended. Then one of the dogs began barking, sharp and frantic. Peterson turned and saw that the animal was staring into the rough ice behind them, its body rigid. The other dogs joined in, a chorus of panic sound that was almost worse than the silence. Peterson followed their gaze and saw movement, something large and pale shifting between the ice slabs, too close, too fast. He shouted for the others to move. They abandoned the broken sled and everything that had spilled from it. The remaining two sleds lurched forward, the dogs pulling with a desperation that overrode their exhaustion. The rough ice became a maze. Peterson lost track of direction. He focused only on forward motion, on keeping the sled upright, on following the dogs as they navigated by instinct. At some point, he realized that Agar's sled was no longer behind them. He called out, but there was no response. He stopped and turned, scanning the broken terrain. Anderson pulled alongside and asked what was wrong. Peterson said Agar was gone. Anderson looked back, his face pale, and said they could not stop. He said that if they stopped, they would not start again. Peterson hesitated, then nodded. They continued. The silence persisted for another 10 minutes, then lifted all at once. The wind returned with sudden violence, bringing with it a whiteout that reduced visibility to nothing. Peterson and Anderson kept moving, trusting the dogs, trusting the route, trusting that the wind meant distance from the Nanurluk. When the whiteout cleared, they were miles from the rough ice. The terrain had flattened again. The sky was lighter. Peterson stopped the sled and dismounted. His legs nearly gave out beneath him. Anderson stopped beside him, and the two men stood in silence, breathing hard, staring back the way they had come. There was no sign of Agar. There was no sign of the third sled. Peterson walked back along their trail for nearly 100 yards, looking for tracks, for evidence, for anything that would indicate what had happened. He found nothing. The snow was smooth and undisturbed, as though Agar had simply ceased to exist. But in one area, off to the side of the trail, Peterson found a wide depression. It was circular, pressed evenly into the snow, identical to the one they had seen near the tracks days before. The depression was still fresh. The edges were sharp, and in the center, barely visible, was a single print, massive and unmistakable. They reached a settlement 6 days later. Both men were suffering from frostbite and exhaustion. The dogs were in poor condition. Peterson reported the loss of Agar and the circumstances surrounding it. He did not mention the Nanurluk by name. He said they had encountered dangerous ice and had been forced to deviate from the planned route. He said Agar had become separated during a whiteout and had not been recovered. The authorities accepted the report. Men disappeared in the Arctic. It was not uncommon. A search was not practical given the distance and the conditions. Agar's family was notified. Peterson and Anderson were paid for the portion of the route they had completed. Neither man took another contract in that region. Peterson continued to work as a guide, but he restricted his routes to areas closer to established settlements. Anderson left the profession entirely within 2 years. In later records, both men were described as competent and reliable, though colleagues noted that they seemed reluctant to discuss certain aspects of their work. In the years that followed, other travelers reported unusual occurrences in the area where Peterson's group had encountered the phenomenon. Several mentioned zones of unnatural silence. 2 separate parties reported seeing large tracks that did not match known animals. One group abandoned their route entirely after their dogs refused to continue in a specific direction. The name Nanurluk appeared in scattered records, mostly in oral accounts collected by researchers studying indigenous Arctic traditions. The descriptions were consistent. A creature larger than a bear, silent movement, a presence that followed rather than hunted, an association with areas where the wind stopped and the ice became unstable. No physical evidence was ever recovered. No bodies, no photographs, no remains that could be examined or verified. The Nannerlock remained, as it had always been, a category of experience rather than a category of specimen. Something observed, something survived, something that controlled not through force but through proximity, through patience, and through an understanding of the landscape that exceeded anything human travelers could match.